Hemostasis. Textbook. Guyton and Hall. Textbook of Medical Physiology. 11th edition. Pages 457 to 468. Chapter 36. Hemostasis and blood coagulation. Part 2. Blood coagulation. Within 3 to 6 minutes after rupture of a vessel, if the vessel opening is not too large, the entire opening or broken end of the vessel is LLED with clot. After 20 minutes to an hour, the clot retracts. This closes the vessel still further. Platelets also play an important role in this clot retraction, as is discussed later. Mechanism of blood coagulation. Mechanism of blood coagulation. Basic theory. More than 50 important substances that cause or affect blood coagulation have been found in the blood and in the tissues, some that promote coagulation, called procoagulants, and others that inhibit coagulation, called anticoagulants. Whether blood will coagulate depends on the balance between these two groups of substances. In the bloodstream, the anticoagulants normally predominate, so that the blood does not coagulate while it is circulating in the blood vessels. But when a vessel is ruptured, procoagulants from the area of tissue damage become activated and override the anticoagulants, and then a clot does develop. General mechanism. All research workers in the field of blood coagulation agree that clotting takes place in 3 essential steps. 1. In response to rupture of the vessel or damage to the blood itself, a complex cascade of chemical reactions occurs in the blood involving more than a dozen blood coagulation factors. The net result is formation of a complex of activated substances collectively called prothrombin activator. 2. The prothrombin activator catalyzes conversion of prothrombin into thrombin. 3. The thrombin acts as an enzyme to convert brinogen into brinburs that enmesh platelets, blood cells, and plasma to form the clot. General mechanism. Let us discuss the mechanism by which the blood clot itself is formed, beginning with conversion of prothrombin to thrombin. Then we will come back to the initiating stages in the clotting process by which prothrombin activator is formed. Conversion of prothrombin to thrombin. First, prothrombin activator is formed as a result of rupture of a blood vessel or as a result of damage to special substances in the blood. Second, the prothrombin activator, in the presence of sufficient amounts of ionic Ca++, causes conversion of prothrombin to thrombin, figure. Third, the thrombin causes polymerization of brinogen molecules into brinburs within another 10 to 15 seconds. Thus, the rate-limiting factor in causing blood coagulation is usually the formation of prothrombin activator and not the subsequent reactions beyond that point, because these terminal steps normally occur rapidly to form the clot itself. Platelets also play an important role in the conversion of prothrombin to thrombin because much of the prothrombin RST attaches to prothroreceptors on the platelets already bound to the damaged tissue. Prothrombin and thrombin. Prothrombin is a plasma protein and alpha-2 globulin having a molecular weight of 68,700. It is present in normal plasma in a concentration of about 15 mg per deciliter. It is an unstable protein that can split easily into smaller compounds, one of which is thrombin, which has a molecular weight of 33,700, almost exactly one-half that of prothrombin. Prothrombin is formed continually by the liver and it is continually being used throughout the body for blood clotting. If the liver fails to produce prothrombin, in a day or so prothrombin concentration in the plasma falls too low to provide normal blood coagulation. Vitamin K is required by the liver for normal formation of prothrombin as well as for formation of a few other clotting factors. Therefore, either lack of vitamin K or the presence of liver disease that prevents normal prothrombin formation can decrease the prothrombin level so low that a bleeding tendency results. Conversion of fibrinogen to fibrin, formation of the clot. Fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a high molecular weight protein, MW equals 340,000, that occurs in the plasma in quantities of 100 to 700 mg per deciliter. Fibrinogen is formed in the liver, and liver disease can decrease the concentration of circulating brinogen, as it does the concentration of prothrombin. Because of its large molecular size, little brinogen normally leaks from the blood vessels into the interstitial fluids, and because brinogen is one of the essential factors in the coagulation process, interstitial fluids ordinarily do not coagulate. Yet, when the permeability of the capillaries becomes pathologically increased, brinogen does then leak into the tissue fluids in sufficient quantities to allow clotting of these fluids in much the same way that plasma and whole blood can clot. Action of thrombin on fibrinogen to form fibrin. Thrombin is a protein enzyme with weak proteolytic capabilities. It acts on brinogen to remove 4 low molecular weight peptides from each molecule of brinogen, forming one molecule of brin monomer that has the automatic capability to polymerize with other brin monomer molecules to form brin burs. Therefore, many brin monomer molecules polymerize within seconds into long brin burs that constitute the reticulum of the blood clot. In the early stages of polymerization, the brin monomer molecules are held together by weak non-covalent hydrogen bonding, and the newly forming burs are not cross-linked with one another. Therefore, the resultant clot is weak and can be broken apart with ease. But another process occurs during the next few minutes that greatly strengthens the brin reticulum. This involves a substance called brin stabilizing factor that is present in small amounts in normal plasma globulins but is also released from platelets entrapped in the clot. Before brin stabilizing factor can have an effect on the brin burs, it must itself be activated. The same thrombin that causes brin formation also activates the brin stabilizing factor. Then this activated substance operates as an enzyme to cause covalent bonds between more and more of the brin monomer molecules, as well as multiple cross-linkages between adjacent brin burs, thus adding tremendously to the three-dimensional strength of the brin meshwork. Blood clot. The clot is composed of a meshwork of brin burs running in all directions and entrapping blood cells, platelets, and plasma. The brin burs also adhere to damaged surfaces of blood vessels, therefore the blood clot becomes adherent to any vascular opening and thereby prevents further blood loss. Clot retraction serum. Within a few minutes after a clot is formed, it begins to contract and usually expresses most of the fluid from the clot within 20 to 60 minutes. The fluid expressed is called serum because all its brinogen and most of the other clotting factors have been removed. In this way, serum differs from plasma. Serum cannot clot because it lacks these factors. Platelets are necessary for clot retraction to occur. Therefore, failure of clot retraction is an indication that the number of platelets in the circulating blood might be low. Electron micrographs of platelets in blood clots show that they become attached to the brin burs in such a way that they actually bond different burs together. As the clot retracts, the edges of the broken blood vessel are pulled together, thus contributing still further to the ultimate state of hemostasis. Vicious circle of clot formation. Once a blood clot has started to develop, it normally extends within minutes into the surrounding blood. That is, the clot itself initiates a vicious circle, positive feedback, to promote more clotting. One of the most important causes of this is the fact that the proteolytic action of thrombin allows it to act on many of the other blood clotting factors in addition to brinogen. For instance, thrombin has a direct proteolytic effect on prothrombin itself, tending to convert this into still more thrombin, and it acts on some of the blood clotting factors responsible for formation of prothrombin activator. Once a critical amount of thrombin is formed, a vicious circle develops that causes still more blood clotting and more thrombin to be formed. Thus, the blood clot continues to grow until blood leakage ceases. Initiation of coagulation, formation of prothrombin activator. Now that we have discussed the clotting process itself, we must turn to the more complex mechanisms that initiate clotting in the RST place. These mechanisms are set into play by 1. Trauma to the vascular wall and adjacent tissues. 2. Trauma to the blood, or 3. Contact of the blood with damaged endothelial cells or with collagen and other tissue elements outside the blood vessel. In each instance, this leads to the formation of prothrombin activator, which then causes prothrombin conversion to thrombin and all the subsequent clotting steps. Now that we have discussed the clotting process itself, we must turn to the more complex mechanisms that initiate clotting in the RST place. These mechanisms are set into play by 1. trauma to the vascular wall and adjacent tissues. 2. Trauma to the blood, or 3. Contact of the blood with damaged endothelial cells or with collagen and other tissue elements outside the blood vessel. In each instance, this leads to the formation of prothrombin activator, which then causes prothrombin conversion to thrombin and all the subsequent clotting steps. Prothrombin activator is generally considered to be formed in two ways, although, in reality, the two ways interact constantly with each other. 1. By the extrinsic pathway that begins with trauma to the vascular wall and surrounding tissues, and 2. By the intrinsic pathway that begins in the blood itself. In both the extrinsic and the intrinsic pathways, a series of different plasma proteins called blood clotting factors play major roles. Most of these are inactive forms of proteolytic enzymes. When converted to the active forms, their enzymatic actions cause the successive, cascading reactions of the clotting process. Most of the clotting factors, which are listed in table, are designated by Roman numerals. To indicate the activated form of the factor, a small letter A is added after the Roman numeral, such as factor VIIA to indicate the activated state of factor A. Extrinsic pathway for initiating clotting. The extrinsic pathway for initiating the formation of prothrombin activator begins with a traumatized vascular wall or traumatized extravascular tissues that come in contact with the blood. This leads to the following steps, as shown in figure. Step 1. Release of tissue factor. Traumatized tissue releases a complex of several factors called tissue factor or tissue thromboplastin. This factor is composed especially of phospholipids from the membranes of the tissue plus a lipoprotein complex that functions mainly as a proteolytic enzyme. Step 2. Activation of factor 10. Role of factor 7 in tissue factor. The lipoprotein complex of tissue factor further complexes with blood coagulation factor 7 and, in the presence of calcium ions, acts enzymatically on factor 10 to form activated factor 10, 10A. Step 3. Effect of activated factor 10, 10A, to form prothrombin activator. Role of factor 5. The activated factor 10 combines immediately with tissue phospholipids that are part of tissue factor or with additional phospholipids released from platelets as well as with factor 5 to form the complex called prothrombin activator. Within a few seconds, in the presence of calcium ions, this splits prothrombin to form thrombin, and the clotting process proceeds as already explained. At RST, the factor 5 in the prothrombin activator complex is inactive, but once clotting begins and thrombin begins to form, the proteolytic action of thrombin activates factor 5. This then becomes an additional strong accelerator of prothrombin activation. Thus, in the null prothrombin activator complex, activated factor 10 is the actual protease that causes splitting of prothrombin to form thrombin. Activated factor 5 greatly accelerates this protease activity, and platelet phospholipids act as a vehicle that further accelerates the process. Note especially the positive feedback effect of thrombin, acting through factor 5, to accelerate the entire process once it begins. Intrinsic pathway for initiating clotting. Intrinsic pathway for initiating clotting. The second mechanism for initiating formation of prothrombin activator, and therefore for initiating clotting, begins with trauma to the blood itself or exposure of the blood to collagen from a traumatized blood vessel wall. Then the process continues through the series of cascading reactions shown in figure. Step 1. Blood trauma causes 1. Activation of factor 12 and 2. Release of platelet phospholipids. Trauma to the blood or exposure of the blood to vascular wall collagen alters two important clotting factors in the blood, factor 12 and the platelets. When factor 12 is disturbed, such as by coming into contact with collagen or with a wettable surface such as glass, it takes on a new molecular configuration that converts it into a proteolytic enzyme called activated factor 12. Simultaneously, the blood trauma also damages the platelets because of adherence to either collagen or a wettable surface, or by damage in other ways, and this releases platelet phospholipids that contain the lipoprotein called platelet factor 3, which also plays a role in subsequent clotting reactions. Step 2. Activation of factor 11. The activated factor 12 acts enzymatically on factor 11 to activate this factor as well, which is the second step in the intrinsic pathway. This reaction also requires HMW, high molecular weight, kininogen, and is accelerated by prekallikrein. Step 3. Activation of factor 9 by activated factor 11. The activated factor 11 then acts enzymatically on factor 9 to activate this factor also. Step 4. Activation of factor 10. Role of factor 8. The activated factor 9, acting in concert with activated factor 8 and with the platelet phospholipids and factor 3 from the traumatized platelets, activates factor 10. It is clear that when either factor 8 or platelets are in short supply, this step is deficient. Factor 8 is the factor that is missing in a person who has classic hemophilia, for which reason it is called antihemophilic factor. Platelets are the clotting factor that is lacking in the bleeding disease called thrombocytopenia. Step 5. Action of activated factor 10 to form prothrombin activator. Role of factor 5. This step in the intrinsic pathway is the same as the last step in the extrinsic pathway. That is, activated factor 10 combines with factor 5 and platelet or tissue phospholipids to form the complex called prothrombin activator. The prothrombin activator in turn initiates within seconds the cleavage of prothrombin to form thrombin, thereby setting into motion the null clotting process, as described earlier. Role of calcium ions in the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways. Except for the RST2 steps in the intrinsic pathway, calcium ions are required for promotion or acceleration of all the blood clotting reactions. Therefore, in the absence of calcium ions, blood clotting by either pathway does not occur. Interaction between the extrinsic and intrinsic pathways. Summary of blood clotting initiation. It is clear from the schemas of the intrinsic and extrinsic systems that after blood vessels rupture, clotting occurs by both pathways simultaneously. Tissue factor initiates the extrinsic pathway, whereas contact of factor 12 and platelets with collagen in the vascular wall initiates the intrinsic pathway. An especially important difference between the extrinsic and intrinsic pathways is that the extrinsic pathway can be explosive. Once initiated, its speed of completion to the null clot is limited only by the amount of tissue factor released from the traumatized tissues and by the quantities of factors 10, 7, and 5 in the blood. With severe tissue trauma, clotting can occur in as little as 15 seconds. The intrinsic pathway is much slower to proceed, usually requiring 1 to 6 minutes to cause clotting. Do you have any question?